Bracing for retaliation, for days, Ukraine was pummeled in an overnight Russian attack. Kyiv reports Moscow launched one of its largest drone and missile strikes, killing at least 4 people and injuring nearly 24 in the Ukrainian capital. President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia used more than 400 drones and 40 missiles in the barrage, adding, quote, almost all of Ukraine was in the crosshairs. Meantime, Russian officials say that a Ukrainian drone attack hit an industrial site in the country's south. Our Fred Pleitgen is in Berlin for us with the very latest. So, listen, we all knew that Russia was going to retaliate sooner or later. Did we expect the retaliation to come this quickly and in this form?
Well, we don't know whether the retaliation or the strikes that we saw overnight, whether that was the real retaliation for those massive strikes that we saw from the Ukrainians on those Russian airfields. The Russians simply said earlier today that these were strikes in response to what they call terrorist activities. But one of the things that we've actually seen in the messaging of the Kremlin over the past couple of days is they've been speaking a lot about strikes on the Russian railway system that they blame on the Ukrainians, for which the Ukrainians have actually not yet claimed responsibility. But they've been talking very little about those strikes on those airfields that, of course, the Ukrainians say did so much damage. Nevertheless, these strikes were massive that happened overnight. You mentioned some of the numbers there, Zain. More than 400 drones, and it really seems as though the Russians have ramped up their own production of those strike drones that they send over into Ukrainian territory. And then also, if we look at the missiles that were used, there were ballistic missiles, which are very difficult to intercept, and really only the best surface-to-air missile systems, like, for instance, the U.S.-made Patriot, can intercept those, and cruise missiles that were used as well. So really a full barrage that was fired by the Russians, but unclear whether or not this was it or whether there is more to come. Of course, we know from that phone call that happened a couple of days ago between U.S. President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin that Vladimir Putin apparently told Donald Trump in that phone call that he would strike back after those attacks on those airfields. But again, from the Russian messaging, it's unclear whether or not this was it or whether there is more to come. And, you know, with all of that being said, this certainly seems as though they were massive strikes, which, as you said, at times the entire country, or almost the entire country, was under a missile air raid alert. And even the Ukrainian Olympic team was affected by all this in the town of Lutsk, a hotel that some of the athletes were staying in, were hit by a blast. There was one athlete who actually managed to record some of what was going on there. So devastating strikes that happened overnight, several people killed, but right at this point in time, unclear whether there is more to come from the Russians, Zain.
See you, Fred Pleitgen, live for us there. Thank you so much.
New video coming into CNN. Now you can hear what Ukrainians have experienced over the last few hours. Russia's launching a wave of drones and ballistic missiles across Ukraine, killing at least 4 people and wounding dozens more. Joining us now is Leon Panetta. He served as Defense Secretary and CIA Director under President Obama. Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for joining us. Do you see these latest Russian strikes showing that Vladimir Putin is making good on his threat to retaliate big time after Ukraine's rather humiliating attacks on Russian airfields in recent days? How far do you think all of this will go? How far will Putin go?
I think the clear message is that Putin is going to continue this war without pressure from the United States, without pressure from President Trump. He feels that he is in control of this situation, and he's going to continue to hammer Ukraine, largely because President Trump will not put pressure on Putin. And as a consequence, he thinks he has a license to continue to do this and not participate in any kind of ceasefire. It is a very tragic situation right now in Ukraine.
It's a horrible situation indeed. President Trump, as you know, Mr. Secretary, spoke to Vladimir Putin on Wednesday. I want to play for you and for our viewers and get your reaction to something that Trump said that he told the Russian leader. Listen to this.
Sometimes you see 2 young children fighting like crazy. They hate each other and they're fighting in a park. and you try and pull them apart. They don't want to be pulled. Sometimes you're better off letting them fight for a while and then pulling them apart. And I gave that analogy to Putin yesterday. I said, President, maybe you're going to have to keep fighting and suffering a lot, because both sides are suffering, before you pull them apart, before they're able to be pulled apart.
The President of the United States comparing the two sides, Ukraine and Russia, to fighting children. What do you make of that analogy?
I think what it tells me is that there's a total abdication of leadership by the United States in dealing with Ukraine. For the president to now turn his back on that situation and say that somehow they've just got to continue to fight until they're exhausted is not leadership. It is not leadership. The president ought to be putting pressure on Putin by saying very clearly, if you will not agree to a ceasefire, then we will do everything in our power to help Ukraine defend themselves and ultimately defeat you. That's the message that Putin has to hear. And he's not hearing that. What he's hearing is a weak president basically turning his back on the situation and giving Putin a license to continue these horrible attacks.
One Ukrainian lawmaker actually told CNN that President Trump essentially gave Putin the green light to attack. Do you agree?
I don't think there's any question. The president just basically, after this conversation, has said, let him go ahead and keep fighting. He basically gave a pass to Russia. It is incredible to me. Every president we've had in the last 80 years has stood up to tyrants and has made very clear that they cannot have their way. This is the first president in my memory who basically, instead of standing up to a tyrant like Putin, is essentially allowing him to have his way and not putting any kind of pressure on him to do what is right, which is to achieve a ceasefire. This is historically, I think, will be viewed as the United States totally failing in leadership to be able to stand up to a tyrant who brutally invaded a sovereign democracy. That's the message that history will write.
Joining us now to discuss this and more is Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group. Ian, thanks so much for joining us. As you know, President Putin promised a retaliatory strike for Ukraine's rather daring and successful drone attacks deep inside Russia. Do you think the overnight assault was that retaliation, or could another major strike still be coming?
I mean, if it is, it's not much of a retaliation. With of course, not to minimize the civilian deaths that we're seeing in Kiev, but the Russians have been targeting civilians, unlike the Ukrainians, all the way through this war. And Ukraine has been able to shoot down an awful lot. That's very little compared to $300 drones taking out $100 million strategic bombers of Russia. And even in Putin's controlled information environment, that's not going to look like much of a retaliation. So no, I don't think we've seen the full extent of what we're going to expect from Putin at this point.
Yeah, I suspect you're right. Presidents Trump and Putin spoke on the phone on Wednesday. President Trump said the Russian leader told him Moscow would have to respond to Ukraine's drone attack. A Ukrainian parliamentarian is accusing Trump of giving Putin an actual green light to do so. Do you think that's how Putin actually sees it?
I guess he sees it as a flashing yellow. I mean, President Biden tried the stick against Putin to try to get him to back away from this illegal invasion, and Biden failed. Trump has now tried the carrot with Putin to sweeten the offer, engage diplomatically, say that he'll get rid of sanctions, willingness to engage on national security and economic investment. And Putin has said no. So they both failed. And I think the more important meeting this week, Wolf, was yesterday in the Oval Office with Chancellor Merz from Germany. And here, what we see is that the U.S. and NATO are much more aligned on Ukraine today than they were a month ago when Zelensky was getting beaten up by Trump in the Oval Office, and the U.S. was suspending intelligence and military support. We're very far from that. Trump is now thinking about washing his hands from the diplomacy, but he has a critical minerals deal with Ukraine. And you're going to see continued U.S. intelligence support and weapon sales to support the Ukrainians on the ground. So in that regard, the war is ongoing, and there's going to be a lot of pain and human suffering and a lot of cost. But the Americans aren't walking away from NATO, aren't walking away from Ukraine. I think that's quite important.